Hi everyone, welcome back. Another video for you. I have so much to talk about in so little time. Let's get right into it. Go over to the Patreon, patreon.com/ Eric Draitzer if you want to see all of the videos, both those that are on the YouTube channel freely available and those that are only for the subscribers. And for those of you that are already subscribing, I got a lot more goodies coming to you guys in the coming days and weeks, especially since you've been so patient as my productivity has dropped in the last couple of weeks and maybe the last month or so. So, what can I tell you? Life is hard. Things get in the way physically, mentally. People get sick, people get busy, and so forth. So, that's what it means to be independent and to have no staff and to do this all by yourself. And so sometimes I don't put out something when I should, and I feel bad about it. But here I am. I got plenty to say. Let's talk about it. I don't know how many people are jumping around and following all of the news that's going on, other than the things that grab the headlines. But hopefully, you're coming to me to focus on some of the stories that both are in the headlines to contextualize them, and also those that don't really get much attention from the mainstream press here in the United States or in the West generally. Or, hey, if you're watching me from somewhere that's not in the West and you do see different perspectives, that's very interesting. I would love to know more about that. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the most recent news, that is the Ukrainian strikes inside of Russia. This has been the talk of the internet, the talk of social media the last 48 hours or so. I'm recording here on the morning of Tuesday, December 6th. So, actually, this morning, Russian time, there was another strike. So, that brings the drone strikes that are, I think everybody pretty much has agreed that they are carried out by the Ukrainians, even though the Ukrainians are not formally acknowledging that this brings the total up to three of these strikes in the last 2 days inside of Russia. So the strike today was in the city of Kursk, which is closer to the Ukraine border. Kursk is also, I think, probably known in the West, to the extent that it is known in the West, because of the Battle of Kursk, which was one of the real turning points in the Soviet Red Army's fight back against the Nazi invaders. Kursk, and by the way, my grandfather received an Order of Heroism for the defense of Kursk. He was a reconnaissance pilot who was involved in taking photographs of German positions before the Soviets actually defended, or actually, I guess I should say, attacked and liberated Kursk. My grandfather was awarded the Order of the Red Banner for his extraordinary heroism, both in that engagement and also in single handedly shooting down Nazi warplane and saving his pilot, and many other acts of heroism that he was responsible for as a soldier in the Red Army. So, and maybe one day I can talk a little bit more about my grandfather and why he never, ever, ever once spoke about any of his war experiences and never had anything to say about any of the time that he spent in the Soviet Union, including the 10 years that he served in a Soviet prison, which is its own very interesting story. But I digress. Let's focus on what's in front of us. So, this Kursk attack here this morning allegedly did not cause any casualties, supposedly strike on an oil tanker of some kind. There were images being posted on social media of black smoke billowing out from some facility there. I think we can probably assume that that is the case. Yesterday, we had attacks at the Engels Air Base and in the city of Ryazan. The Engels Air Base, interestingly, is the home of Russia's strategic bomber fleet, which is very important because it is from this base that many of those bombers that have carried out missions and or have fired missiles into Ukraine, they are housed there. So if anything could be a legitimate military target inside of Russia, it would be these military bases, these air bases that are directly responsible for meting out death and destruction and raining down hell on uh, millions of Ukrainians. So I guess that's the first point that I just want to make, that I have to laugh when I see some of the discourse online from the Putin cheerleading camp when they talk about how Ukraine is escalating, Ukraine is, inappropriately, asymmetrically responding, this and that, right? That Ukraine is the warmongering country, that Ukraine is carrying out these egregious crimes. I would just simply remind everybody that Russia invaded invaded Ukraine, not once, but twice in the last 8, 9 years, and that Russia is occupying Ukraine. Russia illegally invaded Ukraine yet again in 2022. And since that point, all actions carried out against Russian military are, by international law, legitimate and legal. Now, one could talk about the political ramifications of carrying out these kinds of attacks. Absolutely. And I am going to talk about that in just a second, especially with respect to the United States and the extremely awkward position that the Biden administration finds itself in. But from a purely moral and legal perspective, it's beyond discussion, it's beyond question that these are legitimate targets. Only an absolute fool or disingenuous, cynical prick would say otherwise. Let's talk a little bit about promises made, because the promises made by the Zelensky government to Biden, I think, are extremely important because, well, what do you want to call it? Maybe it's a promise, maybe it's an assurance, maybe it's just a subtle implication. I wasn't in the room. I don't know what those representatives and what they may have said, but it is commonly understood in the mainstream press that to some degree, Biden more or less forced Zelensky to promise that they would not strike inside of Russia, with, of course, the understanding that the Biden administration, above all else, is afraid that escalation to attacks inside of Russia will force Russia to then escalate in various ways that could potentially spin out of control. And I naturally agree with the Biden administration to the extent that their position is a genuine one. Yes, of course, the danger of escalation, as I have said on these videos dozens, hundreds of times. It is the cycle of escalation, the internal logic of war that creates this disaster, right? That escalation breeds further escalation. And I think that in this current war, that is all the more true. So, one of the ways that the Biden administration has attempted to avoid that kind of escalation and to prevent precisely what we've just seen, namely attacks on strategic targets inside of Russia, the Biden administration has tried to limit that by limiting the types of weapons that it is sending to Ukraine. As we know, they've sent the HIMARS, firing systems. They've also sent various other, I guess, smaller and I don't know, what's the militarily appropriate term, lower tech kind of not advanced weapons. But of course, Ukraine has been howling for more advanced weapons, for more weapons, so that they can obviously fight the country that's invaded theirs. But the Biden administration has limited this. And in fact, Wall Street Journal recently reported that the Pentagon, the Department of Defense, that their technicians have actually modified the HIMARS that they've been sending to Ukraine in order to prevent, or I guess to remove, the capability of those HIMARS systems from shooting long range, which is very interesting because it goes to the heart of the issue about the US Ukraine relationship here. While the United States is certainly funneling weapons to Ukraine, they're not funneling nearly the scale of weapons or the scope of weaponry that either the Ukrainian government has asked for or that the Putin cheerleading camp pretends they have. I don't think most of those people actually read the reports and actually look into the matter and actually try to ascertain the degree to which the United States is actually providing the weapons. How much? How many? To what extent? How advanced? Are they modified? Do they require U.S. advisors to fire them? If they do, how much training is involved? How many U.S. advisors do we think are on the ground in Ukraine? It's obviously not zero, but it's probably not thousands. So again, I think that we have to be reasonable in trying to understand what's happening here. As I mentioned, the Wall Street Journal has reported that they modified those HIMARS, so that would then explain why these strikes inside of Russia are being carried out by drones as opposed to being fired by, HIMARS rockets. So again, I think that it's an awkward position for the Biden administration. Please excuse the sound of shuffling paper. As I mentioned, there is this kind of I said awkward. It is awkward, but it's also sort of tenuous position that Biden finds himself in between, on the one hand, supporting Ukraine and continuing U.S., foreign policy to the extent that we could call it foreign policy, supporting NATO, supporting Ukraine, supporting allies, etc., the obvious stuff, right? On the one hand. And on the other hand, Biden really has to avoid escalation because Biden definitely is not prepared for what possible effects escalation might have, what escalation would even look like from the Russians, and what effect it would have globally, both economically and politically. Um, at the same time, Biden has to control Zelensky. I mean, Zelensky is not a, as much as the Putin bootlicking squad wants to pretend, Zelensky is not a Biden puppet. He doesn't do everything that Biden tells him to do. And in fact, I think we see with these strikes, Zelensky at times goes ahead and does the opposite of what Biden wants, almost in some ways forcing Biden into very interesting political quandaries. In this case, of course, as I mentioned, between support for Ukraine, but also trying to make reality to the words that the Biden administration has spoken about wanting to avoid escalation. So what this actually tells us, and that was kind of a confused way of making the point in that last statement. Let me try to restate it. Basically, I think what we can take away from this, among many things, but one point is that Russia is not the only country that has the capability to escalate this conflict. In fact, Ukraine also can escalate. Sure, Ukraine can't escalate with the threat of tactical nuclear weapons. Ukraine can't escalate with the possibility of mobilizing a 1 million man, 2 million man, 5 million man army or whatever, right? Ukraine can't do that, but they can escalate in other ways, including strikes inside of Russia. So we need to keep an eye on what it means to escalate in this conflict and recognize that it is not only Russia that can escalate. Now, that being said, I'm in no way making a moral condemnation of what Ukraine has done. As I said at the outset here, striking military targets is 100% legitimate, even according to international law. Ukraine is a country that has been invaded. They are fighting against a country that has invaded them. All military targets are on the table. All military targets are legal. Now, this is in distinction to what Russia has done inside of Ukraine, where actually none of the targets are legal or legitimate, and especially civilian infrastructure, which is what the Russians have been targeting: water systems, electrical grids, agricultural facilities, processing plants, and so forth, right? So there's an asymmetry in terms of the kinds of escalation we see and in terms of the kinds of attacks that we can see. All right, I got to move on because there's still so much to discuss. I am jumping around a little bit, but I wanted to touch briefly at least on that story. Now, let's talk a little bit about some of these statements that we've seen recently. In fact, I would say probably the most reasonable statements that we've seen, and I think my Ukrainian friends will have to forgive me for this one, but Macron, the president of France, has recently made some fairly interesting statements that I think speak to quite a number of issues. Macron has been blasted for these statements by certain figures in Europe, and let's just talk about what he said. So I think the headline: Macron blasted for saying Moscow needs security guarantees to end the Ukraine war. So Macron is giving an interview with a French TV station, TF1, and here's his quote, among several, but I'm just going to focus on this one. Quote: one of the essential points we must address, as Putin has always said, is the fear that NATO comes right up to its doors and the deployment of weapons that could threaten Russia. End quote. Eminently reasonable, one would have to say. In fact, it is pretty much objective reality. It is an objective truth that NATO has pushed up close to Russia's borders, and it is objective truth that NATO represents, at least from the Russian perspective, a threat. Now, whether it's actually a threat or whether that's the Russian way of manipulating, interpretations in order to serve their own agenda, I would leave that debate for another time. That's not what's at interest here. What's of interest here is the idea that the French president is making this statement, which goes against some of the more hawkish voices that you see within the European Union and within the European space more broadly. So he goes on to say, Macron goes on to say that it is actually about both protecting allies and members of NATO and also giving guarantees to Russia the day that it returns to the negotiating table. He doesn't lay out what those guarantees might be. I think we all have some ideas, but that goes back to Putin's demands pre invasion, right? But the question, I think maybe we should think of it more as almost a metaphysical question at this point for Europeans is it a betrayal of Ukraine to even suggest that Russia might have some security concerns that need to be addressed by Europe and the United States? Well, I would argue no, it isn't. Now, again, I think that we have to be sort of mindful of the fact that not everyone is going to see it that way. We have to be mindful of the fact that it is unclear if Russia would even negotiate in good faith, given what we've seen these last 10 months. And I perfectly understand and am inclined to agree with Ukrainian observers who say there is zero reason to trust anything, including any offers that are made by the Russians. Now, that being said, Ukrainians are not the only ones involved in this broader conflict when we're talking about Europe. All of Europe is involved as we see the economic turmoil in Germany. We see it in France. We see it all over the European continent. Now, this is the real question here because Macron is basically saying, I'm not agreeing with Putin, but we have to take what Putin says seriously. And if we're serious about ending this war, we're going to have to address what he, meaning Putin, sees as his major security concerns or the security concerns for Russia. Now, contrast that with the former defense and foreign affairs minister from Lithuania, Linus Linkevicius, who rejected Macron's statement, saying, quote, if anyone wants to create a new security architecture that allows a terrorist state to continue its methods of intimidation, they should think again, end quote. Now, it's fairly clear, obviously, what he means, right? So there is no reason to offer a new security architecture to the country that just disrupted European peace and invaded Ukraine. Makes sense, right? But Lithuania, like Ukraine, is not exactly bearing the full economic brunt of this situation. France and Germany, above other countries, probably are. So, again, the idea that Lithuania is somehow speaking for all of Europe is not true. It's just not true. Now, you could agree with what the Lithuanian minister said that to create a new security architecture is essentially conceding to Putin and allowing Putin to declare victory. Okay, I suppose that's a position to take, but unless one has a better alternative other than continue this war indefinitely, well, then you're going to have to take seriously what Macron says, because certainly leadership throughout Europe is not interested in an indefinite war in Ukraine. However, that being said, Macron does not make the policy for the Ukrainian state, nor does he influence necessarily the way that Ukraine is thinking about these matters. So we have a quote in relation to Macron's quote, a response. This was actually, I think, a tweet from Zelensky's advisor Mikhailo Podolyak, who is one of the more vocal and interesting and quotable members of the Ukrainian government. He says, quote, it will only be possible after, meaning to negotiate and to take Russia's security concerns seriously, it will only be possible after the tribunal, the conviction of war authors and war criminals, imposition of large-scale reparations, and bloody clarification of quote, who is the one to blame, end quote. I don't know what this means, to be honest with you. Is the idea that we should not negotiate until the war is over? Does that actually make any sense to anybody? Again, I'm not trying to dump on the Ukrainian government perspective here, but it's hard for me to understand how one can genuinely say that they would like to have peace and simultaneously look at the situation and say no, only total victory, and that's the only way we ever get to a negotiating table. it just does not make any sense. And unfortunately for my Ukrainian friends, there is going to come a debate and they are going to engage in it. At what point is the war being ended the primary goal? Now, I have to say that given the understanding that the actual primary goal is not to end the war, it is to defend their families, their communities, their loved ones, their homes, their country, right? So if you're a Ukrainian, who cares what Lithuania has to say, what France has to say, what anybody has to say? Your focus is to fight the invaders. And I think anybody can understand that. But we're not all Ukrainian. We don't all live in Ukraine. And many people, both in the United States and in Europe, are beginning to worry, as I've been saying all along. They're beginning to worry that this is a long term war, that Russia will dig in for month after month after month, potentially year after year, if possible. Okay, so given that scenario, and given what is obviously the limited patience and resources coming from the West, what exactly does Ukraine think is going to happen here? Okay, I think we need to be very honest and sober about thinking through the implications of these positions that people are taking. So the bottom line here is that Macron's statement, while it was incendiary for some, I think he was probably speaking for, I don't know about the majority, but a big proportion of the ruling establishment in Europe, the establishment that both doesn't want to knuckle under to Putin, knows that the Russians are criminally responsible for everything that's happened in Ukraine, and simultaneously knows that there's not going to be an end to this war until they come to the negotiating table, and there's not going to be a negotiating table until Putin's concerns are taken seriously. Whether they're real or manufactured by Putin's own mind, who cares? That's what they say are his priorities. So that's that. I think we need to be mindful of that. All right, let's talk a little economics. Speaking of pain in Europe, economic pain in Europe, there's more sanctions coming. The European Union is going to propose sanctions on Russia's mining industry. I'm going to try to do this in just a couple of minutes, but I think it's important so that we understand the actual dynamics, because I have friends in Europe who are like, oh, the Europeans are destroying themselves by sanctioning Russia. Russia is laughing, ha ha ha, all the way to the bank as the Europeans are screaming in the night because their electricity bills are skyrocketed and this and that. Okay, I think that there's an element of truth to that, but there's also the other side of that, that Europe has spent the last 10 months preparing very methodically based on the evidence that we've seen, preparing to move away from Russia in all economic aspects. And so now that we're 10 months into this war, I think it's clear that another phase of the economic war against Russia is now about to be initiated. And this has to do with Russia's mining industry, which is one of the critical linchpins of the entire Russian economy. So the European Commission, by the way, we should note, we've talked a lot about oil and gas. Oil and gas, this is obvious, right? This is the first place you go when you're thinking about Russia economically. It's the first reason, it's the first issue that Europe addressed, knowing that there were other industries inside of Russia that were also critical for European production and economic output. And so they kind of slow walked to get to that point. Now we're there. It's going to be interesting to see how the Europeans shift away. So let's talk about this. The European Commission has now proposed a ban on new investments in Russian mining. Now, banning new investment is very interesting because it doesn't say that they're banning current contracts. They're not banning sales that are already in effect. They're banning new investment. Okay, so what is Russia's mining sector economically? In fact, Russia's mining sector makes up 25%, a quarter of all foreign investment in Russia pre war. A quarter of all foreign investment was in mining. Okay, so now that is going to be in question. That's not something that the Russian central bank is going to be able to manipulate by raising the interest rates into the stratosphere like they did to prop up the currency in the early phases of the war. This is hard production. These are commodities, and these are commodities that are no longer going to be sold to Europe, at least, moving forward into the future. So this is the first direct targeting of Russia's metals sector, and this is very important, both because it's going to hurt Russia, that's for sure. There's no question about that. But at the same time, it's quite likely that Russia's then going to take its own countermeasure. Maybe they halt shipments into Europe of current, contracts, current contracted trade. Maybe they, have some other asymmetrical economic response. I don't know. It's not clear yet, but something will come in response to this. So before this point, the Europeans, especially the Americans too, but in particular the Europeans, really feared that going after Russia's mining sector would actually disrupt the entire global supply chain. So much depends upon some of those minerals that the Russians bring to the world market that it could have it. There was a fear that it would have major negative impact. Okay, it seems like at the very least now they're to some degree comfortable with the idea of doing this and with whatever possible effects it might have. So let's talk about a couple of these companies. One, which is a massive, I don't know if they're technically a conglomerate, but a massive, massive mining and oil company known as Glencore, which is based in Switzerland. This is a trading and mining company, and they own an 11% stake in EN Plus, which controls Russia's largest aluminum producer. Okay, other companies, BlackRock, Vanguard, UBS Asset Management, these companies hold stakes in major Russian mining companies Norilsk Nickel and Evraz. In other words, some of the biggest investment companies in the world are heavily leveraged into these Russian mining interests. What's going to happen when these sanctions come into place? We've seen in prior waves of sanctions that there's a sort of self sanctioning that goes on where companies, knowing that the sanctions are in place, don't want to run afoul, just tangentially through the course of normal business. And so they preemptively leave Russia or, modify the way that they're operating. Will this happen again? I don't know. It's not totally clear. But we do know that the sanctions are also going to include export controls, and specifically export controls on technology that Russia, at least according to European Western sources, technology that Russia is importing for the purposes of supporting its arms factories. So here's an export control that's directly, at least allegedly, targeting Russia's war machine, Russia's ability to continue to prosecute this war. Now, you could say it's legitimate, you could say it's illegitimate. I don't know. I'm not the expert who did the analysis, but what I can tell you is that the Russians cannot produce without Western technology. This is a fundamental understanding of the entire Russian economy. They cannot produce without Western technology, and it's not like China can just come in and substitute for every Western good. So this is a very real concern for the Russians. It's definitely a real concern for the Europeans, how the Russians might respond, what impact this is going to have on inflation. Remember, a lot of these minerals, these go into a lot of different components, a lot of different products that are dependent on these. So two of the commodities that are being targeted, or rather, excuse me, two of the commodities that are not being targeted, that are likely to be exempted from these sanctions. One is titanium, the other is palladium. Now, just very quickly, titanium has many, many, many applications in daily life, especially in the aerospace industry, planes and rocket ships, and all kinds of things. The automotive industry, medical equipment, surgical implants, all of those, screws that go into your bones, and all of those things that surgeons use to repair our bodies and all of that. Titanium, right? It's a non-toxic element that can be, safely put into people's bodies. And so again, turmoil in the titanium sector, for titanium prices could then have other economic knock-on effects. How much more expensive does medical equipment become? How much more expensive do medical procedures become? How much more expensive does the cost of repairing a plane become if titanium supply is disrupted? The other one, palladium, also a very important rare earth mineral, especially for the purposes of the automotive industry, particularly catalytic converters. Catalytic converters, I believe, make up somewhere between 50 and 75% of the entire global use of palladium is for catalytic converters. Very interesting. And of course, also it's used in aerospace, jewelry, electronics manufacturing, many, many, many other uses as well. So these two countries, these two minerals are likely not going to be part of the sanctions. But if we recall the last time Russia responded to sanctions, we recall that Putin precisely targets those products that the West is unwilling to sanction. And he himself may ultimately sanction. That is to say, either remove them from the global market or redirect those sales to other parts of the world to the extent possible, or simply reduce the amount of sale in order to create conflict and panic in Europe and in the United States, but especially in Europe. And I guess that's probably where we want to focus the rest of our few minutes. Geez, I'm already at 30 minutes, so I'm over the time now. But let's talk a little bit about opinion. There's a lot going on with regard to public opinion around this war. A lot of people say a lot of things about what people seem to think, and very few have any real hard data to back this up. So when we see a poll that comes out about some of these issues, it's worth paying attention to, but it's also worth interrogating for a lot of reasons. I'm going to talk about that in a second. So, the headline that caught a bunch of attention in the last day or so: growing U.S. divide on support for Ukraine. Now, naturally, various elements around the world, including Russian propaganda, is trying to make this viral because the findings are very, very important and very worrisome if you're pro-Ukrainian, especially a pro-Ukrainian who is focused on the United States and U.S. public opinion. According to this poll, which was conducted by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. I admit I don't know that organization. Sounds legit, but I don't know. I don't know them, so I can't really say. I assume it's on the up and up, but I don't know. Chicago Council on Global Affairs, according to their poll, this was the one that really caught the headlines. 47% of Americans want Kiev to settle for peace as soon as possible. 47%. So basically, half of Americans who were polled for this survey said they want Kiev to settle for peace as soon as possible. It's interesting, but let's dig a little bit deeper. At the same time, so let me just the idea, I guess, in one's mind, if you knew nothing about the United States, which if you know nothing about the United States, you are lucky. You are a fortunate soul. Continue knowing nothing about the United States. Ignore everything that happens here. We're a blight on the planet. But for those of us who are unfortunately here or who have to deal with being here and deal with Americans, American public opinion is important. It does drive legislative priorities. It does drive the executive branch, the president. It does drive a lot of U.S. foreign policy. Not all of it, of course, but it does have an impact. So it's important to pay attention to. So while half of Americans, or almost half of Americans, say they want Kiev to settle for peace, at the same time, in the same poll, 65% want to continue supplying arms, 66% want to continue providing economic aid, 73% want to continue accepting Ukrainian refugees, and 75% want to continue sanctioning Russia. So, is that do we what do we glean from this, if anything? I mean, if you just read the headline, you'd say, "Gee, half of Americans they don't necessarily go with all of this support Ukraine, support Ukraine." But then you look at it, it's like, no, they actually do. What they're specifically responding to is this question of settling for peace, whatever that means. Because you remember, and I just want to make clear, and I'm not saying this to denigrate, America or to denigrate Americans, but I'm an American. I've lived here my whole life. My family comes from Ukraine, but I was born here. I know this country. I know the people of this country. And I could tell you that if you were to pull 99 out of 100 people on the street know almost nothing about the war in Ukraine, about the specifics, about what the grievances are, about the history, about what's happening now, what happened in February of 2022, what happened in 2014, what happened in 1991 and 1992. They know nothing of any of this. Okay, so this is another example where American ignorance to some degree is I guess, a factor. At the same time, I don't think it's unreasonable if you don't know much about the war. It's not unreasonable to say, yeah, we want peace. We want peace now. That's good. That's a good instinct. The desire for peace is good. It's a good instinct to have. And it's certainly a good instinct to see Americans who are naturally fairly indifferent to the suffering of people around the world, especially when we're the ones doing it most of the time. It's nice to see that Americans at least have some inclination towards peace. But yet, there's a lot more here, and there's a lot more that complicates that picture. And again, I'm not saying this to say I don't want to see peace and I want to denigrate Americans who want peace. No, quite the opposite. I also want to see peace. I also want to see an end to the war. But I also am not going to pretend that it's just about the question of peace or war. It's a lot more complicated than that. Who's winning, according to this poll? 26% of those surveyed said Russia's winning. 26% said Ukraine is winning. 46% said neither is winning. Isn't that interesting? The plurality of respondents saying neither is winning, and simultaneously the plurality of respondents saying that Kiev should settle for peace immediately. I would say that those two things are probably linked, right? The perception in the United States, especially, if you, to whatever extent this is even getting coverage anymore on the news. I mean, if you're watching mainstream, news, Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, PBS, whatever it might be, if you're watching mainstream news, it seems like you don't really get a very accurate picture of what's going on. One day it seems like Russia's winning, the next day it seems like Ukraine is winning. Bottom line is ambiguity for the American observer, ambiguity about what's actually happening. And I think that speaks to this large number who are saying that they would be in support of Kiev settling for peace immediately. Now, at the same time, when you say 47% of Americans want Kiev to settle for peace immediately, in the same poll, 40% said we should support Ukraine indefinitely. Okay, so just 7% less saying support Ukraine indefinitely. 27%, so a good quarter of respondents would like US military intervention. Okay, so just think about the insanity of the United States for a second. Okay. And I'm actually going to talk about Russian polling data in a few minutes where we talk about Russian insanity for sure. But 27% US military intervention, not to say necessarily that they're saying they want a US military intervention to fight a war against Russia. At least according to these respondents, they're saying they want U.S. military intervention to end the war quickly. What the hell does that mean? Insane. Absolutely insane. 29%, so even more, saying that they would support a gradual withdrawal of support for Ukraine. So nearly 3 in 10, 29% saying they want to withdraw support for Ukraine. What party do you think they belong to? And what segment of that party do you think they belong to? Again, the Trumpist, far right, sort of isolationist tendency, which pretends to be anti-imperialist but actually isn't. That wing, I think, accounts for the vast majority of that 29%, and much of that has to do with people like Tucker Carlson and others that they bring on there to talk about how, well, it's those dirty Ukrainians and Hunter Biden's laptop and all of this garbage. I mean, this is, I think, the withdrawal support for Ukraine contingent. I think most people, and I say this both in terms of my everyday interactions in the workplace, out in the world, talking to people, friends, people I've just met, whoever it is, I think most people do not support gradual withdrawal of support for Ukraine. However, those that are big time into the MAGA world, they do. And I think it's interesting. I think we should probably think about why that is. Um, According to this poll, the phrase support Ukraine for as long as it takes today in well, I guess in November of 2022, that number 48% support Ukraine for as long as it takes. In July, 58%. So again, going to the larger point here that Ukraine is losing some of the broad support that it had in the United States. Now, again, as I've been doing, you could get more granular and you could kind of probe that a little bit and ask if that's really true or what are these numbers really telling us. But at a very general level, looking at trends, that would be worrying for Kiev. A loss of 10% of support among the US population in what, 5 months, 6 months, less than 6 months. I think that's a big problem for them. Now, for those that would, for the question of urging Ukraine to settle for peace immediately, now 47%, July 38%. Again, the numbers are going the wrong way if you are a Ukrainian partisan who wants to see this war won by Ukraine. Definitely not going in the right direction as far as US public opinion goes. And I think that's something to pay attention to. This poll got a lot of news, it got a lot of headlines, but it's not the only poll. It's not the only polling data that we have and that should be paid attention to. In fact, we also have very interesting polling data from Russia. Now, it should be said, this polling data is leaked information that comes from internal Kremlin polls. This is published by a well known, well respected Russian journalist who now writes on Substack. I would highly recommend you follow her work and support her work. I will link to it in the notes in the description for this video. Um, But the headline, What Secret Russian State Polling Tells Us About Support for the War. Very, very, very interesting. Just as I was trying to do in parsing through the polling data from the US side, I think we really need to do the same for Russia. Now, we have to say that polling in the United States and polling in Russia are vastly different. Polling in Russia is a much more complicated procedure, primarily because it's very difficult to ascertain to what extent people are actually telling the truth. There is a long-standing fear of state repression in Russia that is not only rooted in Putin and Putin's government, that goes back to the Soviet era. That again goes back to the very nature of Russian political culture, which did not exist prior to 1917. There was no real political culture, certainly not in any form of civic sort of bourgeois, democratic, responsibility or whatever, right? That didn't exist in Russia. Russians are generally apolitical, an apolitical society, and they are especially skeptical of giving truthful answers to polling agencies. So, that being said, they are doubly skeptical of giving truthful answers to polling agencies that they believe are actually working for the Kremlin, internal polls. Okay, so that raises some questions about the nature of these polls, but at the same time, there are very real, very serious experts that do this for a living in Russia, and we have to pay attention to that. Okay, so you have the Levada Center, which is, I think, any Russia watcher knows the Levada Center. This is the foremost polling agency in Russia. They are an independent agency. They are not controlled by the state. So the Levada Center on the one hand, and there's another state-controlled polling agency. I don't know what it stands for. I forget, but it's VTSIOM is the acronym. Um, so, according to the publicly available polling, roughly 75% of Russians support the war. Okay, that's the Levada and the VTSIOM polls. Those are already known, understood publicly. But there is now internal secret polling from the Kremlin, from polling experts inside of the Kremlin, that raises a number of very interesting questions. So, three questions. Let's ask them. Internal poll asks three questions: should the war have been started, whether the war is going according to plan, and whether the war should be continued. Okay, let's take the first question. The statement didn't need to start the war. As of November 17th, 2022, 60% agreed that Russia did not need to start the war. Now, in the spring of 2022, uh, that was uh, wait a second. Sorry, it's 70% saying that now. 60% in November. Let me I just mixed up the numbers. Didn't need to start the war in spring of 2022. 70% today. 60%. Age is a major factor. Okay, 60% of 18 to 45-year-olds are against the war. Okay, against the war. Young people account for most of the drop in the number. Now, over 45 years old, 75% support for the war. So, if you were to take Russia, just 45-year-olds, yeah, you got about 75% support for the war. If you were to include 18 to 45, that drops to about 60%. Now, if you go further than that, though, and you look a little bit more carefully, I think the number is even greater than that. There is a big increase of young people saying that they are, quote, unsure about the war. That's 36%. Okay, that's a big increase. Now, there are experts that provided some, perspective on this who made the point, and I agree, that the answer of unsure is essentially a way of avoiding giving the wrong answer. There's a lot of fear, especially since Putin announced the partial mobilization in September. There's a lot of fear inside of Russia, fear of saying the wrong thing, of doing the wrong thing, of ending up on the wrong list, and then finding yourself on the front in Ukraine or something. So, because of that fear, there is also a fear of giving the wrong answer to a polling agency or to anybody doing a survey, especially if you believe that that survey is also being monitored and you are being monitored. And in fact, it seems like there is a big proportion of young people in the country that think precisely that way, that are not going to say yes or no. They're going to say unsure. But what do they actually think? I think it's reasonable to assume that a proportion, some significant proportion of that 36% would actually answer that they are against the war if they could answer freely without fear of any kind of retribution. The number who say that the war shouldn't have been started, but paradoxically, that it should continue, that is increasing. Very, very interesting. So the number who say the war shouldn't have been started has increased. The number the number who say that the war should be continued has also increased. So 67% as of November 2022, 67% or two out of every three believe that the war should be continued, and only about 18% said that the war should be ended immediately. Now, again, this speaks to the nature of polling and the options that are presented to respondents. So I don't know how much we can glean from that other than the most general conclusion that most of Russia, for various reasons, is continuing to support this ghastly war. So the experts are saying that we really are looking at, it's not so much a paradox, but something like almost a truism of Russian society, or at least Russian society in recent years, namely the idea that we shouldn't have started it, but we need to go on. In other words, the war was a mistake, but we can't lose, so we have to win, right? That mentality, which may seem, insane, a little schizophrenic or whatever. In fact, that is, how a lot of Russians are thinking about this. There has also been a shift in the propaganda, and I think this is also worth paying attention to. The issue was denazification, Ukrainian biolabs, all of these other things, all of this stuff, Satan worshiping, and all of this nonsense that they said about Ukraine. All of that propaganda kind of faded away because it was all bullshit to begin with, as I said, as many others had said. That has faded away. And in its place, the propaganda has shifted into a sort of like, yeah, well, you know what? It's not so important if starting this war was right or wrong. Yeah, we started it. Maybe it was right, maybe it was wrong. But you know what? Now we're in a war with NATO, and we have to win or they will destroy us. They will kill us all and they will destroy Russia forever. Right? So you have this sort of what do you want to call it? It's almost like a coping mechanism, right? That Russians are able to sort of cope with this brutal reality by saying, yeah, okay, fine. Yeah, it was a mistake, but now we got to win, right? In other words, they absolve themselves in a sense of the responsibility for having tried to stop the war, right? They absolve they essentially absolve Russia of its crime of invading Ukraine by saying that Russia has to win. It's a really interesting dynamic here. Denis Volkov of the Levada Group says that this is actually similar to the poll results that they saw in 2014 around the annexation of Crimea. He says, "quote Was it worth it? No, the cost is going up, including for Russians personally. But since we got ourselves into this mess, we must keep going." Right? This is the attitude. This is the idea that, okay, yeah, maybe we shouldn't have waged the war, but now that we did, we have to win it. We have to keep going and we have to, defeat the West, defeat NATO. Now, there's another interesting aspect to this that I think is worth paying attention to. The fact is that this poll, or the survey, didn't really offer other options. And given other options, say like peace talks, immediate peace talks, the numbers change and the number of respondents increases. So again, this speaks to the nature of polling. This speaks to the nature of the choices that you include in a survey and what the biases that exist, and also the desired outcomes, I suppose, if you're a propagandist. All right, let's boil it down to the very basics. Inside of Russia, support to continue the war, 67%, two-thirds. Stop the war, 18%. Difficulty answering, 13%. So again, you could basically break it down. If you were to say difficulty answering is basically another way of saying stop the war, then that would, and we combine those two, which is maybe a little bit questionable, but maybe not. That puts it at about 31% or so, with a 2% margin of error. So more or less, two-thirds of Russia supports continuing this war. Now, the question of whether the war is going according to plan, 22% say it is going according to plan, 42% not according to plan, 36% difficulty answering. In other words, most of Russia knows that Russia is failing in this war, and simultaneously, most of Russia wants to continue it. Amazing. So when you think about the results of these surveys, both the Chicago survey of the United States and its public opinion, and this internal Russian survey, there's a couple of dynamics and a couple of trends that come through. One is that uh, the ultimate effect of the propaganda in manufacturing consent, either for continuing the war from Russia's side or in continuing to support Ukraine from the US side, that favors Russia. Russia has definitely more successfully manufactured consent for its policies than the United States has, for obvious reasons, including the fact that Russia is able to crush public opposition, to crush dissent, to arrest and to disappear whoever needs to be arrested and disappeared, and so forth. And in the United States, public opinion is much more complicated than that. There are many, many, many polling agencies, many ways of conducting polls, and I think we all know that you can get a poll to say almost anything, but I don't mean to undermine the credibility of the poll entirely, because I do think that the survey really does reflect the broad trend of US public opinion, which is my life sucks. Inflation is killing me, and I don't care about Ukraine. Harsh words, but that's the reality when it comes from the mouth of an American chauvinist. And as we all know, America is a country of chauvinists. So, what can I tell you? That's where it stands. I think that we should be mindful of how dangerous this moment is and not forget that this isn't business as usual. We are into an extremely dangerous period of history. We're all living through that. And the danger doesn't just come from world war, right? The danger comes from all directions and from all possible ways that this could spin out of control. Uh, what else can I say? Stick with us here. Go to Counterpunch, follow my work, and I will have more on what's going on. And well, unfortunately, it's a bit depressing. But what can I say? We have to do this work. We have to keep paying attention to what's happening, and we have to keep upholding peace. That's what there is. Talk to you all next time.